Alrighty, so here's our first lesson on Unit 8, and we're going to talk about how humans impact ecosystems. Be prepared. None of this is going to be happy. All right, so you can think of just like we talked in like our first or second unit, we talked about how organisms have a range of tolerance, and that we talked about for like environmental factors, like there's a pH or a temperature range that organisms are healthiest at. Well, you can kind of think of that. Happening for pollutants as well. So, organisms have a range of tolerance for pollutants. Usually, that's probably going to be on the lower end of things or the lower concentrations. And as you increase the concentration of pollutants, that is going to be like the point at which you have damage, health effects, reduced growth, reduced reproduction, increased death, and impacts on the population. So let's talk about coral reefs. So coral reefs are these large structures composed of colonies of corals. Corals are actually two different organisms living in a mutually symbiotic relationship. There are the polyps, which form the calcium skeleton that forms the physical structure of the coral. And then there are microscopic symbiotic organisms called zooxanthellae that are going to produce glucose and stuff like that. But the key is they are photosynthetic, which means they need access to light. But since about 2009, we've lost about 14% of the corals in the entire ocean. So the causes of this are, well, one thing is increased ocean temperatures. So as climate change continues and global surface temperatures rise, that results in an increase in the ocean's temperature as well. So here we see with prolonged thermal stress what happens. So these zooxanthellae are going to create the colors that we see in corals. That's what makes them whatever color they are. But as the temperature gets higher and the coral becomes stressed out, they expel the zooxanthellae, and those are going to be released into like the water, and that's going to cause the corals to start turning white, and that's what's called coral bleaching. So coral bleaching is a sign of very unhealthy coral, and the next step is with increased or continuing uh, thermal stress, meaning continuing excess temperatures, the coral dies, and then it just gets covered in algae. The problem with this is that coral reefs are hotspots of biodiversity in the ocean. They are essential. The corals themselves are very important for nutrient cycling in those areas, which are traditionally nutrient poor. And so they support a wide variety of food webs, of organisms in the food web. Then you can also have sediment running off into the ocean, and that can decrease light penetration, and that's going to kill those photosynthetic zooxanthellae, and then that's going to harm the coral as well because they rely on sugar from photosynthesis. Then you can also have fishing practices that aren't careful about damage to coral reefs. So, coral reefs tend to grow on the ocean bottom in shallow areas, but if you do bottom trawling where you're dragging a net across the ocean floor, that can destroy coral reefs, which then will have a negative impact on the local ecosystem because coral reefs serve as nurseries for a lot of fish. If nothing else, think Finding Nemo. Where are those fish babies being raised? In a coral reef. So this map is showing you the kind of distribution of coral reefs around the world's oceans, as well as which of them are having higher threat levels. So anything that is highlighted in blue is experiencing low threat levels, so it's probably not going to experience as much damage. So you see a segment of that out in the South Pacific. It's about as far as you can get from people. Some of Australia's Great Barrier Reef is also experiencing low threat, probably due to conservation efforts. It's the largest coral reef system on the planet, so there's it's a great tourism draw, and so Australia has various reasons to protect it. Then you see in the dark red area, that's the very high levels of threat, and that's areas like Indonesia, here in the Caribbean, areas where you have a lot of people, you have a lot of interactions between humans and that ecosystem that can then cause decreases in the health of the coral reefs. Another negative impact we have on the ocean is oil spills. So what will happen is there, for whatever reason, you have oil spilling into the water. This is the oil that we're drilling to try and process to make gasoline and stuff. And then organisms get exposed to those hydrocarbons. Oil is kind of sticky, it's viscous, it sticks to organisms. This can be a problem if it gets into the gills of organisms, if it covers them, it can make them sick, they can die. Um, and like, if a bird gets coated in oil, it may interfere with its ability to kind of fly. Animals groom themselves, and if you have a cat or a dog or some sort of mammalian or bird pet, they groom themselves a lot with their mouths. So if they're trying to groom off oil, they'll be ingesting some of that, and oil is not a good thing for anyone to eat. Then you also have some of the oil may sink to the bottom, to the ocean bottom, and then that can kill bottom dwelling organisms as well. Then as time progresses, oil will eventually wash up on beaches. That has negative consequences on tourism. Nobody wants to go visit an oil soaked beach, but it also negatively impacts the fishing industry because fish in that area will then become unhealthy. They might start dying or they might have weird mutations. For example, I've seen some things about New Orleans and the shrimping industry after a massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that we're going to talk about on the next slide, and the shrimp had weird tumors and things that just made them not the kind of shrimp that you could catch and then sell, because people aren't going to want to buy things that have weird growths on them or that are very oily. So that has had a big impact on like Louisiana's shrimping industry. So this oil spill that I'm going to talk about is kind of the biggest one in history. It's the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that's offshore drilling for oil. So the Gulf of Mexico has a number of offshore oil drilling platforms. You may hear about them when you hear about a hurricane coming in, how they'll have to evacuate those. Well, something happened, ended up leaking large, extremely large amounts of oil. So this gray shaded area that you're seeing, that's kind of the area that got covered by the oil that was released. And then the red stuff that you see, that's the coastline that was most heavily affected by this. So that would be parts of Louisiana's coast, all of Mississippi's coast, all of Alabama's coast, and part of Florida's coast as well. And then keep in mind that the oil that was released spread throughout larger parts of the Gulf. So while Texas may not have seen as many direct impacts from this, I'm sure there were impacts on the coastline, Galveston, Corpus Christi, etc. And the problem is, here's kind of a diagram showing um, this like how the oil was kind of leaking. And so what you had is you had some oil that was going to the surface, so it was floating up to the surface. Then you had some of the oil and natural gas that might have been trapped by its density in between layers of ocean. And then you have some of it that settles to the ground as sediment. And so that can affect wildlife and the ecosystems at every level of the ocean, from the surface to the deeper layers, all the way to the bottom of the ocean. And so that had a massive impact. There are still impacts that are being seen from it. The oil company that is responsible for this, BP or British Petroleum, has to pay damages until about 2031. So the year 2031 is when they get to stop paying for the cleanup, although cleanup will probably continue after that. Another problem in the ocean is dead zones. So what happens is, we've talked about eutrophication before. Well, you have nutrient pollution. You have, excess fertilizer, nutrients, whatever, that are going to be released into waterways, gets carried off as runoff, and then ends up draining to the ocean. when that causes eutrophication. Remember, in eutrophication, the excess nutrients cause an algal bloom, which may seem great. Hey, lots of producers, but then those algae die and they're decomposed. Decomposition is just a special form of cell respiration, which means you're going to use up dissolved oxygen. So that means you decrease the dissolved oxygen. And when you decrease the dissolved oxygen, well, things that are living in the water still need oxygen. Animals in the water, they take in oxygen, they just take it in through their gills. So when you decrease dissolved oxygen, that kills things. And that's what creates these dead zones. Things cannot live in that area because there's just not enough oxygen. So one thing you'll notice is this is very common where you have water draining into the ocean from land. So where you have dead zones would be like, for example, the mouth of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. You've got drainage from a large part of the central United States where a lot of agriculture is happening. So excess fertilizer runs off, all of that drains into the Mississippi, empties out at New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico, and then that creates these dead zones. Notice that all the red areas, all these coastal areas, those are areas where you are very commonly going to find these dead zones. And then there are some other areas where you have hypoxia. Hypoxia means you have low dissolved oxygen. And so that's going to cause increased death of organisms in the area. To kind of monitor the impact of this, you can use a type of graph called an oxygen sag curve, which is going to graph dissolved oxygen levels versus your distance from a source of pollution. So, say we have this as our source of pollution, and this axis is our amount of dissolved oxygen. So, this is the amount of dissolved oxygen that you find in that body of water without any pollutants. Then this is showing you this axis, the x-axis is going to be your distance. So you have a release of nutrients into a body of water. That's going to decrease your dissolved oxygen because of eutrophication, and it's going to take some distance for that oxygen level to increase. So everywhere where you see this kind of reddish orange is where you have low dissolved oxygen levels. Also notice the source of oxygen for all of this is going to be the air. So O2 from the air is then going to go into the water. It's going to go from the top level of water to the bottom. The deeper the body of water, the longer it takes for dissolved oxygen levels to increase. And so you'll have this area where you have this oxygen sag, this decrease in oxygen. That's going to be kind of your dead zone where you're not going to have a lot of organisms living. The farther you get from the dead zone, the farther you get from the source of pollution, the higher the levels of dissolved oxygen. Then, some of the other things that we end up accidentally dumping into water are heavy metals. So, heavy metals are produced from a number of things. You can produce them from cities, from industry. Mining is a common source of heavy metals. You can have some from agriculture, and those will run off into local water sources. Um, and that can then impact our drinking water supply. For example, in Dallas, we get our water from the Trinity River, which, at least when I was growing up, was stereotypically thought of as a super polluted river. So if you think about it, rivers are a common source of our drinking water. Anything that gets into those rivers is going to impact what we drink, which can have negative health impacts. And then there's also another problem in that some bacteria that live in water can take mercury that's been released and ends up in waterways and turn it into an even more toxic form called methyl mercury. You may have heard, for example, that pregnant women are not supposed to eat fish too often, and that's because some of the fish that we eat are carnivorous fish and they tend to build up toxic levels of mercury. And so, if pregnant women are eating large amounts of fish, that could increase the amount of mercury in their bodies, which could have negative impacts on development of their fetus and then have serious impacts on the health of that child throughout their life. Then we all know there's trash in the oceans. I'm sure you've seen images of the garbage patches. So the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is kind of the most famous one. It's where a lot of the trash that ends up in the ocean kind of congregates because of ocean currents that are going to help kind of scooch those together. And then you've probably also heard about how, sea turtles end up taking in or eating or getting a lot of plastic straws stuck in them. Well, the problem is organisms, they'll see some of this plastic and they'll mistake it for a food source. For example, turtles will see plastic bags. And when they're floating in the water, they kind of look like jellyfish, which is their food source. So then they eat that plastic bag, and then it's going to cause all sorts of problems in their intestines, which, if it blocks their intestines or if they choke on it, it could kill them. And then any toxic substances that are in that trash can also be introduced into the food chain as well. And we're going to talk more about the impacts of that on not only aquatic ecosystems, but on us as well in another future lesson. Another pollutant that can enter waterways is sediment. You may think, oh, it's just dirt, but if you have too much dirt running off, wherever you have exposed soil, like we talked about soil erosion in agriculture, any place you've cleared land, like a construction site, if you've done clear cutting in an area and just cut down all the trees and cleared the land, all of that increases sediment runoff. And when you have too much dirt in the water, that's going to decrease your light infiltration, which means your photosynthesizers are going to starve or die. So that's going to decrease your primary producers, which has an impact on the entire food chain. And it also impacts anything that relies on sight in order to hunt. So any visual predators are also going to have a negative impact on their population survival. Then that sediment can also settle to the bottom, which not only can disrupt some habitats for organisms, but there are some organisms that rely on like rocks and stuff, relatively clear areas of rocks on the beds of rivers or streams in order to spawn. Spawning is them releasing eggs and sperm, so it's basically going to be their reproduction. And if you disrupt that, then that means you're going to have lower population amounts. So that can have a negative impact on food chains, food webs, and the whole ecosystem. So that is my sadness at how we impact ecosystems. We're going to talk about other ways we impact ecosystems in this unit, which is going to cover some terrestrial and water pollution.